All right. Hey, Sudbury sports fans, welcome to the show. Welcome to Sudbury Sports Talk Live. I'm AJ Walsh. Today we'll be talking Wolves. That's Sudbury Wolves. Joining me to discuss some of the latest, greatest in Wolves country is the one, the only, Randy Pascal from SudburySports.com. He is that Sudbury sports guy. He's a local sports writer and local personality. You've all heard of him, and now you're going to hear from him. Welcome to the show, Randy.
Thanks, Aaron.
We're talking today the Wolves, basically, but I want to start off by asking you, how are you making out during this time of social distancing and working from home and all that jazz?
Well, surprisingly more stuff to do than you might expect. The natural. I've had some very close friends who have kind of reached out and said, with no sports going on, boy, you must be going stir crazy." And the reality is that there are a number of really good stories that are still out there, even while games and events are not happening. There's certainly a lot of athletes that are just coming off the tail end of the season. We're going to get a chance to talk about some of them, actually, you and I, on air over the course of the next few weeks. And then there's always that historical side as well, which is something that's always fascinated me. So I've got that on the go, doing a lot of stuff with SportLink, the Greater Sudbury Sport Council, that I can still do some work there. And I guess last but not least, it's when you get an event like this, there's, for people that are really busy, and I've talked to a few people who've said they've run into the same thing, there always seems to be that kind of pile off to the side of projects you would like to jump into, but you just never seem to have time to do it. That excuse kind of falls by the wayside right now. So I'm finding myself things like I had noticed along the way that while the local high school website has all of the teams that have ever won the cross country championships over all the years, there's nowhere where it's indicated who the individual runners. So you couldn't go in and find a list previously of all of the midget boys who ever won, the city cross country championships, midget girls, junior boys, and a lot of that information I had access to. So I thought, well, this is silly. I'm gonna put together a list, and through Dave Makala, of course, I just send it off to Dave, and he says, geez, I can upload that. Absolutely. So that's been something I've been working on now, going back. I've got it back to about 2002, 2003, and hopefully through the help of information Peter Hawking left me, my hope is to get it all the way back to the 1970s.
Oh yeah, you got your work cut out for you, and there's the honey-do list, on top of all of that as well. There's no end, and this is the time to do it. And as sports is basically taking a hiatus, a backseat, but in terms of Sudbury Wolves, it's been kind of busy lately.
Yeah.
We just had the OHL draft take place, not this last weekend, Easter weekend, but the weekend before. Tell us a little bit about how the Sudbury Wolves did at the OHL draft.
Well, every team you talk to after any kind of draft, whether it be OHL, NHL, what have you, are consistently going to come out and say, we had a great day at the draft. That's the nature of evaluation, of player evaluation or athlete evaluation is that way, right? You don't evaluate things the same as everybody else, and therefore your feeling is, we have a guy rated in the third round, we were able to get him in the second round. Well, that's because other teams don't have him rated in the second round, or not everybody does. That said, I really like what the Wolves have done this year in terms of especially the early selections, but even the depth through the entire draft. And you start with a kid like David Goyette right off the top, who's acknowledged as having top-end skill. Really nice story there in the sense that he goes to 11th overall to the Wolves. And here's a player who played at an academy in Connecticut, but ends up making a short list of teams that he'd be willing to commit to in the OHL. And Sudbury, lo and behold, is on that list. And of course, Sudbury fans always believe that it's exactly the opposite, that Sudbury's never on the list. It's only London, Kitchener, and maybe Windsor and whoever, right? But Sudbury, Guelph perhaps. But the primary reason why Sudbury's on the list, other than the fact that Goyette feels very comfortable about coming here from a hockey standpoint, is he was born in Quebec and lived in Quebec until about 4 years ago. So he didn't even learn the English language until about 3 to 4 years ago, moved to Brockville area with the family at that point. And he's a very academic kid. So that was his reasoning behind heading off to the U.S. this year to play with the academy and put up astronomical numbers in Connecticut. But because of Sudbury being such a Francophone community and having post-secondary options that are Francophone in nature, it's opened the door for David Goyette to be maybe a player who who knows, might have gone a little bit earlier in the draft if teams above the Wolves or drafting before the Wolves had access to the Francophone. I think logically it sounds like it would have been Sudbury, Ottawa would have been his two primary choices. And thankfully for Sudbury, Ottawa was quite a bit later. You go on from Goyette in the first round, and the second round pick, Coach Delic, another high skilled player, another forward, Evan Conyon in the fourth round, player out of Pittsburgh, originally from Newmarket, has been down in the States for a while. So what the Wolves appeared to have targeted more than anything else is skill, and more skill. And I think that bodes well for the team. Was maybe a little surprised at the fact that they didn't take any defensemen early, but then the more you think about it, the more you realize they're actually in really good shape as far as the defense core coming back next year. And so anybody they draft this year is probably being pegged on their blue line brigade for the 21-22 season and not the upcoming year.
Yeah, now there also was another draft the Wednesday right after the weekend, and we saw it was the under-18 draft. If you can just take a few seconds to explain that draft, and it's only the fourth time that draft has taken place. So a little bit about the draft and what it is, and basically how the Wolves fared in the under-18 draft.
Sure, fair enough. Well, the entry draft, the one that took place on the Saturday, obviously, is for minor midget, by and large, minor midget players. So that would have been this year your group of 2004 born players. As much as that draft goes 15 rounds and a lot of players are taken, there are players, still hundreds of players that are right on that bubble that could have potentially been taken, but that weren't in their draft year. Some of those players obviously still have aspirations to perhaps get drafted and end up playing or maybe go on as a free agent and play in the OHL. So what the league did a few years ago in conjunction with the Ontario Hockey Federation was they implemented a U18 draft. So for players that might have been missed the year before. It's only a 3-round draft, only 2 rounds if you don't take a goalie in one of the top in your first 2 rounds. But it's aimed directly at kids that then go back to play AAA midget hockey, which was the other area that the province was having trouble in terms of, once kids got through minor midget, so they've got 3 years of midget hockey, they play their first year, then they all wanted to go off and play junior. So even if you weren't drafted into the OHL, the thinking was I'd be better off to go and develop somewhere in a junior C league, a junior B league, a junior A league, somewhere around the province. And that was making it very tough for midget AAA teams to remain sustainable with their players. They didn't have any of the first years, and if you lose the second and third years, you don't have much left. So they implemented this draft. The Wolves have actually had some success. You think, okay, well, the likelihood of you getting a player that can actually play, I would say more have not played by far. More have not played than have played. But if you look at the Wolves, Emmett Sorensis, who now is definitely a part of that blue line core, was in a U18. Played up here in Sudbury as part of the Oakville team that came up for the TELUS Cup. Looked phenomenal. Wolves drafted him. He's now developed and played. He was certainly in the top 2 pairings more often than not this year. So good sign there. They drafted Mitchell Weeks the year after. And there are other players that have kind of worked their way through. And this year, the Wolves decided to go with 3 more players added to the mix. So Jack Parker from the Nepean, a talented forward, goaltender Gavin McCarthy from Brockville, and then a teammate of his, Owen Hardy, another forward drafted in the 3rd round by the Wolves. So, would I expect any of those 3 players necessarily to be playing for the Wolves come September, notwithstanding COVID? They're probably a little bit more of a long shot, but you never know. And certainly for the year after, your hope is that if they continue to develop, again, these people have a tendency to think sometimes that, it's linear. So if you're the best player at age 15 or 14, you're necessarily going to be the best player in the group at age 16 or 17. And that's not always the case. There is a lot of correlation, but it's not, there is some leapfrogging that goes on as well. And that's really what you're looking for, is to try and identify maybe that late bloomer, the diamond in the rough a little bit, and hope that if put in the right environment, that he'll come along.
Now, there's also another draft called the import draft. The Wolves welcomed 2019 draft choice Frederick Dichow, welcoming him to the team. So that's the 3rd draft in 3 drafts. Can you just explain how that works into everything?
Absolutely. So the import draft has been around for a while. That's the draft whereby the CHL teams, so Quebec, Ontario, and Western Hockey League teams, are able to access European talent, largely European talent, and certainly we've seen a number of players that goes back. God, it's got to be 20 years now at least, I would think, because I think somebody like Alexei Semenov would have been early on. Nedved from the late 90s, early 2000s with the Wolves. And of course, that's also where in more recent years, that was interesting because that draft, they eliminated the ability to draft goalies for a while, with the idea being that hopefully it would help in terms of goalie development in Canada. The OHL ended up, or CHL ended up doing a 180 on that a few years back. Thank goodness, because that's how Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen ended up making his way to Sudbury a year ago. And this time around, so last year in the draft, the Wolves drafted, depending on the pronunciation you hear, I've heard Frederick Dyko, Frederick Dichow. Who knows? I guess we'll find out when the young Dane arrives in Sudbury. But there's a lot of excitement. He was drafted. He's a Montreal Canadiens fifth-round draft pick from 2 years ago, ended up playing in Sweden last year, and now has committed to play OHL hockey for the upcoming year, and certainly gives Wolves hope that their goaltending situation could be solidified for the upcoming season. And then if you throw, the returning players, and then the obvious wild card that is Quinton Byfield, if he should happen to be returned to OHL hockey, and I don't think it's impossible. I would have said impossible last September, October. I don't think it's impossible any longer. It still isn't a sure thing, but if he does come back, now you've got the makings of a team that has, certainly middle to upper level of the Eastern Conference that you'd be looking at.
So now going back to the OHL draft, we're going to be talking about, there were some Sudbury natives basically drafted in the OHL draft. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it wasn't a deep year for Sudbury kids, and even the ones that did make it have kind of taken a little bit of a circuitous route in terms of their getting to the OHL. The top local connection kid would be Wilson Farrow. Now, Wilson Farrow, I consider certainly to be Sudbury product. He played all of his hockey through to minor Bantam, including his minor Bantam year in Sudbury. His father then was a school principal, ends up retiring. The mother already worked out of Toronto with one of the provincial ministries. So they end up moving down to Toronto. Makes as much sense as anything. He's a high-end kid. Ends up playing a couple years of GTHL hockey, and lo and behold, he gets drafted by the Sudbury Wolves in the Silks 6th round. So Wilson Farrow, smooth skating defenseman, definitely the strongest out of the 2004 age group coming out of Sudbury. That was apparent even before he moved. And then after that, it was a little bit all over the map. Sam Asinaway gets drafted in later rounds. Noah Bone gets drafted in later rounds. Cutter Gauthier, who I would say is not as strong a Sudbury connection, he got drafted in the 4th round by Kitchener, I believe. And his connection to Sudbury is more so through his father, Sean Gauthier, who was Sudbury born and raised, goaltender, drafted by Kingston, ended up playing his OHL hockey in Kingston, went on to play pro hockey for years and years, and ends up settling down later in life, mid-30s, late 30s, in the Arizona area, where Cutter ends up playing his hockey initially. So Cutter Gauthier is committed to the U.S. National Team Development Program for next year. I don't think you'll see him in the OHL, perhaps at all, but certainly not for a couple of years.
As always, interesting, Randy, keeping us connected with everything Sudbury sports. I'd like to thank you for being on the show today.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
And we're going to catch more of Randy coming up momentarily. We're going to be covering all kinds of other stories that he's working on. You can look up Randy all over the internet and social media, including his latest. He just has his Instagram account, and it's on fire. So you'll want to catch him there. So I'd like to thank everyone for watching today. Like and share the video so that way all the other Sudbury sports fans can stay connected with Randy. Thanks, and we'll catch you on the flip side. Stay safe.